The question is that the bill be now read a second time. The member for Dawson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As I rise today to speak against the Constitution Alteration Bill, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice 2023, I want to remind the House how successful our Constitution and democracy has been since the Constitution came into effect in 1901. Our Constitution has given us laws, liberties, protections and privileges that gives us the Australian way of life, and that is the envy of the world. I, along with the other 150 members of the Parliament, represent 151 electorates across Australia. Each member has approximately 110,000 constituents. We also have 76 elected senators, 12 representing each state and territory. We are chosen by people through a democratic vote as a person to best represent all of our electorates. As we all know, our constituency across Australia comes from many different walks of life, whether that be race, career, religion, culture or gender. And our job is to represent all of our constituents without fear or favour. Later this year, Prime Minister Albanese, wanting to make his moment in history, will be asking the Australian people to make a choice through referendum, to vote on the government's proposed changes to the Australian Constitution. This is a major change and should not be taken lightly. In Australia, since 1901, there have been 44 referendums, and only 8 have been successful. In the past, part of the process prior to the referendum is a convention, where bodies come together to nut out the proposal and examine the pros and cons. But for this referendum, there's been no constitutional convention. Instead, there was a 4.5-day committee process. The Nationals have expressed concerns about this committee process and examining and the considerations to this bill. The limited time afforded to the considerations on this bill has been inadequate and is extremely disappointing. Thankfully, it is the Australian people who get the final say as to whether we change or whether we preserve our Constitution. But what worries me, when I've asked the views of my electorate, the hard reality is that most people don't know what voting yes will mean for Australians. This is because the Prime Minister wants us to vote yes on a vibe, without detail or explanation. The Prime Minister is treating Australians like mushrooms. You wouldn't apply for a job without knowing what that job entails. You wouldn't marry your lifelong partner without speaking to them, getting to know them, or understanding who they are. And you wouldn't buy a house without knowing the price or carrying out an inspection first. So why are we being asked to make a decision on a question that comes with no information, no detail and little understanding? Now, after 12 months in government, we've seen the Albanese Labor government's inability to plan. We've seen more broken promises than you can poke a stick at, and we've seen rushed and poorly thought-through policy changes. We've seen a disregard for what industry and small business need, and we have seen a real disdain towards the regions and rural Australia. This Labor government seems to miss the mark when it comes to knowing what people really need. Labor has created a cost of living crisis, and now they are trying to divide the nation on the basis of race. When this, the 47th Parliament of Australia, first came together on the 26th of July 2022, Prime Minister Albanese promised, under his reign, an inclusive term, a united term and a transparent term. But this is one of many broken promises we've seen over the past 12 months, and we're now seeing it again, with this proposed amendment to enshrine the Canberra Voice in our Constitution. Where is the inclusivity? This voice is already causing divide, and we are only just starting to talk about it. Where is the transparency? The detail? What is the Prime Minister trying to hide? Deputy Speaker, adding another layer of Canberra bureaucracy is not going to fix the issues that our First Nations Indigenous community are facing. Throwing money in more Canberra public servants at an issue will fix nothing. History has proven this. The 1973 Aboriginal Consultative Committee was the first advisory body for First Nations people, and the delegates were voted in by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Even then, the body was dissolved after it attempted to gain powers it was not originally afforded. Then, in 1985, National Aboriginal Conference, which was disbanded by the Labor Hawke government after it became obsessed with factional fighting rather than supporting the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. After that, it was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was dissolved after a report concluded it had not connected with First Nations people, being too Canberra-focused. Its successor, the Indigenous Council, was disbanded for very similar reasons. And now, established in 2019, we have a National Indigenous Agency, NIAA, who receive $4.3 billion per year of taxpayers' money to lead and coordinate Commonwealth policy development, program design and implementation, and service delivery for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The NIAA also provides advice to the Prime Minister and the Minister for Indigenous Australians on whole-of-government priorities to lead and coordinate the development and implementation of Australia's Closing the Gap targets in partnership with Indigenous Australians, and to lead Commonwealth activities to promote reconciliation. And after all this, all of these pre-existing groups and bodies, here we are yet again, faced with making a decision on which ultimately is just another layer of thick red tape and won't close the gap for Indigenous Australians. As history has shown, another taxpayer-funded Canberra bureaucracy will do nothing to help practically improve the welfare of Indigenous communities, especially for women and children in regional, rural and remote areas. In simple terms, our nation needs a better bureaucracy, not a new one. The Nationals are a party solely dedicated to rural, remote and regional Australia. We're a party that learns from history, and our history has shown us that our bureaucratic efforts haven't closed the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations peoples. Our vulnerable communities have real issues, issues that our Canberra public servants don't live through and have no real understanding of. There needs to be a frontline, evidence-based and place-based services to empower our First Nations peoples and their elders while respecting their culture. When we head to the polls, Australians are going to be asked whether we will support a constitutional enshrined Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. Deputy Speaker, Australians have the right, when being asked to vote in a referendum, to have the detail and know what are the consequences for voting yes or voting no. Prime Minister Albanese has deliberately geared his yes campaign around emotions and virtue signalling, and not the facts. The Coalition has asked 15 questions on this Canberra Voice, and to this date not one of these questions has been answered. Are we not entitled to know exactly what the voice means to all Australians? Instead, it seems our Prime Minister wants to shame us into voting yes and to make us feel we are racist if we vote no. This is just not the Australian way. Crucially, Deputy Speaker, a core component that underpins our free democratic society in Australia is that all Australians are equal. In my previous role as Mayor of Whitsunday Regional Council, I had the privilege of conducting many Australian citizenship ceremonies, and part of this role was to explain to the new citizens what the values of being Australian is all about. Australian citizenship is a common bond which unites all Australians, whether they're Australian traditional peoples, first-generation migrants or the descendants of early settlers. Our rich heritage stems from the contributions made by all the people who live in our country. After all, we are the melting pot of the world. But enshrining the Canberra Voice into our Constitution will do nothing but divide us. Any constitutionally enshrined body based solely on a person's race does not align with our values or principles, and nor should it. Deputy Speaker, amongst our elected federal representatives, there are 11 Indigenous members who represent all of their constituents, not just some of them. I too was elected to represent all of my constituents, no matter their race, religion or gender, and that is what I will continue to do. The Australian people want unity, and unity is what they deserve. A government that deliberately creates a racial divide and is deliberately not transparent is not a government that deserves to lead our nation. Deputy Speaker, for these reasons, I will be voting no to the Canberra Voice to Parliament. And it's fine for the Australian people to vote no. It's not racist to vote no, and I believe if you don't know, then vote no.
Member for Swan.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Many